April 17th, 1943. 13:42 hours. The air raid sirens over Bremen had fallen silent 20 minutes ago. Oberst Heinrich Müller stood on the roof of the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory, surveying the damage from the morning's American bombing raid. Smoke rose from 3 buildings on the eastern perimeter where B-17s had scored direct hits. The spring wind carried the acrid smell of burning oil and smoldering wood. Around him, fire crews worked methodically, their hoses creating rainbows in the smoke-filtered sunlight. Müller was the senior Luftwaffe liaison to Bremen's industrial complex, responsible for coordinating air defense with production schedules. He had watched the American formation approach, 65 B-17 flying fortresses in their distinctive combat box formation, plowing through flak, absorbing fighter attacks, pressing toward their target with what seemed like mechanical inevitability. His fighters had shot down 8 of them, perhaps 10. The burning wrecks dotted the countryside between the coast and the city, marking the Americans' path with funeral pyres. 8 bombers destroyed, 60 crew members dead or captured. For the Americans, this was an acceptable loss ratio, brutal mathematics that traded men and machines for industrial disruption. But Müller understood something his superiors seemed to miss. The mathematics only worked if the losses were sustainable. If the Americans could replace the bombers faster than German fighters could destroy them. He pulled out his pocket watch, a gift from his father, engraved with the family crest. 1343. The American formation would be approaching the Dutch coast now, heading back across the North Sea toward England. The survivors, at least, the ones who'd made it through the flak and fighters, who'd dropped their bombs and turned for home, praying their fuel would last, their engines would hold, their luck wouldn't run out over the cold water. Then Müller heard something that made him freeze. A sound that shouldn't exist. The deep, rhythmic drone of Reich cyclone engines. The distinctive thunder of B-17s approaching from the west. He turned, disbelieving. Through the smoke, at perhaps 15,000 feet, another formation was materializing. Not the bombers returning. These were fresh aircraft, a completely separate raid, arriving as the first wave departed. His hand tightened on the watch until the metal pressed painfully into his palm. The Americans weren't just bombing Bremen. They were bombing it twice in one day, with different formations, as if bombers were so plentiful, so expendable, that they could launch consecutive raids against the same target without pause, without concern for losses, without the careful husbanding of resources that define German military operations. Müller watched the second formation approach, watched his fighters scramble again, watched the flak batteries open up with ammunition they just replenished from the morning's barrage. And he understood, with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins, that Germany was fighting an enemy that operated on principles of abundance, so foreign to German thinking that they hadn't even conceived of defenses against it. The Americans weren't supposed to come back. Not today. Not like this. But there they were, blocking out the sky, carrying enough explosive power to reshape German industrial capacity with each mission. And behind them, in factories across an ocean, more bombers were being built. More crews were training. More fuel was being refined. More bombs were being assembled. The watch in his hand ticked forward. 1344. The second formation was overhead now, bomb bay doors opening like the maw of some industrial leviathan. Müller's last thought before the bombs began falling was mathematical. If the Americans could do this, launch multiple raids in a single day against a single target, then every calculation about sustainable loss ratios, about industrial attrition, about the possibility of wearing down American will through defensive victory was wrong. The bombs fell, the factory shook, and somewhere over the North Sea, the first wave of B-17s was already approaching England, their crews exhausted but alive, knowing that tomorrow they would go again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until there was nothing left to bomb or nothing left to defend. German military intelligence had spent months analyzing American bomber operations, and their conclusions formed a coherent narrative of American limitations that made strategic sense within German operational frameworks. The B-17 Flying Fortress, while impressive in its defensive armament and structural durability, was expensive to produce, complex to maintain, and required highly trained crews to operate effectively. Each aircraft represented a significant investment of American industrial capacity: aluminum, engines, instruments, weapon systems. Each crew required extensive training: navigation, bombing, gunnery, coordination. A Luftwaffe intelligence assessment from February 1943 calculated that the United States could sustain a maximum bomber force of approximately 800 to 1,000 aircraft in the European theater, with monthly replacement capacity of perhaps 80 to 100 aircraft. These numbers assumed American industry was operating at near maximum efficiency, that training programs were producing crews at optimal rates, that logistics could support sustained operations across the Atlantic. The assessment concluded, American strategic bombing capacity is finite and calculable. Current German fighter and flak defenses are inflicting losses averaging 6% per mission. At this attrition rate, American bomber strength will decline to ineffective levels within 8 to 10 months unless they reduce operational tempo or accept unsustainable casualty rates among aircrews. The American public will not tolerate losses on such scale. Strategic bombing of the Reich will prove a failed experiment. This analysis was grounded in reasonable assumptions about industrial capacity and public morale. Germany itself was producing approximately 1,000 aircraft per month across all types in early 1943: fighters, bombers, transports, trainers. The idea that America could exceed this production while simultaneously fighting in the Pacific, supplying allies through Lend-Lease, and maintaining homeland defense seemed implausible. Moreover, German planners understood the psychological toll of bomber operations. They had experienced it themselves in the Battle of Britain, where Luftwaffe bomber crews had been ground down by sustained losses, where the courage required to fly into enemy skies night after night had eventually broken even the most dedicated airmen. The Americans, they believed, would face the same psychological limits. Democratic societies, dependent on public support for war efforts, would withdraw from operations that produced casualty rates the German public had been conditioned to accept. The mathematics seemed sound. Each B-17 required a crew of 10 men. A 6% loss rate meant that, statistically, every crew had a 1 in 17 chance of being shot down on any given mission. Over the standard tour of 25 missions, the number required before American crews could return home, the odds of survival were less than 25%. 3 out of 4 airmen would be killed, captured, or seriously wounded before completing their tour. German intelligence analysts believed no democratic society could sustain such losses. They projected that American bomber operations would follow a predictable curve: initial enthusiasm, growing casualties, declining morale, eventual reduction in operational tempo, as public pressure forced military leaders to reconsider the strategy. The bombing campaign would peter out, German industry would recover, and the strategic balance would shift back toward German advantage. What these analyses failed to account for was the scale of American industrial mobilization, not just in absolute terms, but in its psychological and organizational implications. German planning was built on scarcity management, on extracting maximum efficiency from limited resources, on calculating the minimum necessary force to achieve objectives. American planning was increasingly built on abundance utilization, on overwhelming problems with resources rather than solving them with efficiency, on accepting waste and redundancy as prices worth paying for operational flexibility. The cultural divide was profound. German officers who had visited the United States before the war, men like Ernst Udet, who had toured American aircraft factories in the 1930s, had returned with reports of impressive industrial capacity. But they had interpreted what they saw through German cultural lenses, assuming American production would be constrained by the same resource limitations, the same careful planning, the same emphasis on optimization that defined German industry. They had missed the fundamental difference. American industry operated in an environment of resource abundance that made European-style efficiency calculations irrelevant. When aluminum was plentiful, when oil production exceeded all domestic needs, when labor was available and trainable in vast numbers, the constraints that limited German production simply didn't apply. Americans could afford to build bombers that were inefficient by German standards because efficiency wasn't the primary concern, capability was. The B-17 itself embodied this philosophy. It was over-engineered by German standards, with redundant systems, excessive defensive armament, structural strength beyond minimum necessary parameters. A German engineer examining the specifications would see waste, unnecessary weight, excessive complexity, resources allocated to survivability rather than performance. But American designers understood that crew survivability meant experienced airmen returned for additional missions, that structural strength meant damaged bombers could limp home rather than being lost over enemy territory, that excessive defensive armament actually reduced losses to fighter attack. By April 1943, evidence was mounting that German assumptions about American limitations were dangerously flawed. The bomber formations appearing over Germany were growing larger, not smaller. Replacement aircraft were arriving at bases in England at rates that exceeded losses. Crew training programs were producing pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners in numbers that suggested American training capacity far exceeded German estimates. Intelligence reports from Luftwaffe units engaged in bomber interception began including troubling details. A report from JG-1, operating from airfields in Holland, noted, American bomber formations continue to increase in size and frequency. Losses inflicted remain consistent with previous engagements, but replacement aircraft appear within days. We observe no decline in American operational tempo despite cumulative losses that should be unsustainable. Request clarification of enemy bomber production capacity, as current intelligence assessments appear incomplete. The request for clarification went unanswered because German intelligence had no clarification to provide. They were witnessing American operations that violated their understanding of industrial limitations. The only explanations that fit the observed facts were ones they were reluctant to accept. Either American bomber production far exceeded their estimates, or American willingness to accept losses far exceeded their projections of democratic society's tolerance for casualties. The truth was both, and more. American bomber production in 1943 would reach 9,615 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s combined. This was nearly 10 times the German intelligence estimate of sustainable production. An American society, while mourning its losses, was demonstrating a capacity to sustain strategic bombing operations despite casualties that would have broken less industrially advanced nations. The cultural assumption that democratic societies were inherently weaker in sustaining casualties was proving catastrophically wrong. Americans were accepting bomber crew losses precisely because they understood those losses were achieving strategic objectives. Every factory bombed was factory that couldn't produce weapons. Every rail yard destroyed was logistics disrupted. Every mission that returned, regardless of losses, was a demonstration that American industrial power could reach into Germany and extract a price for aggression. German defensive strategy was built on a foundation of assumptions about American limitations that were crumbling under the weight of operational reality. By mid-April 1943, the appearance of double raids, multiple formations against the same target in a single day, shattered the last remnants of that foundation. The Americans weren't just replacing losses, they were expanding operations. They weren't just sustaining the campaign, they were intensifying it. And the industrial capacity behind this expansion was revealing itself to be something Germany had never seriously contemplated, functionally limitless relative to German ability to inflict attrition. Major Hans-Joachim Hermann, a Luftwaffe night fighter ace who had transitioned to day fighter operations, sat in the debriefing room at Wiesbaden Airfield on April 18, 1943, the day after Bremen's double raid. Around him, pilots from his group drank ersatz coffee and tried to process what they had experienced. The conversations were subdued, lacking the usual bravado that followed successful interceptions. Hermann had shot down 2 B-17s the previous day, one from the morning formation, one from the afternoon wave. By traditional metrics, this was success. 2 heavy bombers destroyed, 20 American airmen killed or captured, perhaps 100,000 Reichsmarks of enemy equipment eliminated. But success felt hollow when measured against the scale of what they faced. They came back, Lieutenant Klaus Weber said, staring into his cup. Same day, same target, as if the morning raid was just practice. Herman nodded slowly. He had studied American industrial reports before the war, had read assessments of their productive capacity, had understood intellectually that American resources dwarfed Germany's. But understanding numbers on a page was different from watching those numbers manifest as aircraft formations that seemed to regenerate faster than they could be destroyed. I've been flying combat since Poland, Herman said quietly. France, Britain, Russia. Every enemy we've faced operated under resource constraints. The Poles ran out of aircraft. The French couldn't replace losses. The British husbanded their fighters carefully during the Battle of Britain, conserving strength because every Spitfire lost was precious. Even the Soviets, with their vast territory and population, showed signs of resource management, pulling back when losses became unsustainable, conserving strength for strategic necessity. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The Americans don't fight that way. They operate as if resources are unlimited, as if every bomber loss can be replaced by 2 more, as if crew casualties are simply factored into operational planning rather than being constraints on operations. This isn't bravery or recklessness, it's something else. It's the operational doctrine of a nation that has so much industrial capacity that conservation is unnecessary. Weber looked up. The intelligence briefings say they can't sustain current loss rates. Intelligence briefings also said they couldn't launch double raids against single targets, Herman replied. Intelligence briefings said American public morale would crack under bomber casualties. Intelligence briefings said a lot of things that observation has proven false. Maybe it's time we stop trusting assessments based on what we think the Americans should be able to do and start believing what we're watching them actually do. The room fell silent. Herman's words bordered on defeatism, a dangerous position in an organization where confidence in ultimate victory was enforced through both propaganda and genuine belief. But the pilots around him were combat veterans who had learned to trust their observations over official narratives. What they observed was incompatible with the story they had been told about American limitations. Hauptmann Friedrich Lang, the Gruppe commander, entered the briefing room carrying a folder of reconnaissance photographs. He spread them on the table without preamble. These are from British airfields, taken yesterday afternoon by one of our few remaining long-range reconnaissance aircraft. The photographs showed airfields crowded with B-17s. Rows of bombers parked wing to wing. So many aircraft that they seemed to cover every available meter of hardstand and taxiway. Herman counted quickly. One photograph showed at least 40 bombers at a single airfield, and there were photographs of 6 different bases. This is just East Anglia, Lang said. One region. The British have allocated dozens of airfields to American heavy bomber groups. If each field hosts even 30 aircraft, and there are perhaps 20 fields. He trailed off, letting the mathematics speak for themselves. 600 bombers, perhaps more. And this was just the visible strength. It didn't account for aircraft in maintenance, in training units, in transit from the United States. Our intelligence estimates suggested 800 operational bombers maximum in theater, Weber said slowly. These photographs suggest that estimate is incomplete. Incomplete, Lang repeated with a bitter laugh. A generous characterization. Try catastrophically wrong. The Americans have bomber strength that exceeds our estimates by perhaps double, maybe more. And they're using that strength to launch operations we didn't think possible. Double raids, multiple target attacks, sustained campaigns that should exhaust their resources, but instead seem to accelerate. Herman studied the photographs, his trained eye picking out details. The B-17s were parked in organized rows, not the haphazard arrangements that would suggest space limitations. Ground equipment surrounded them. Fuel trucks, bomb trailers, maintenance vehicles, in quantities that suggested robust logistical support. These weren't bombers carefully husbanded as precious resources. They were bombers treated as abundant tools, maintained and deployed with the casual efficiency of mass production. There's something else, Lang continued, pulling out additional photographs. These are from American training bases. We've managed to get a few reconnaissance flights over the United States. Long-range missions launched from occupied France. One-way flights where the aircraft land in neutral territory afterward. The new photographs showed airfields in the American Midwest and South, and they revealed something that made Herman's blood run cold. Training bases with hundreds of aircraft, facilities sprawling across kilometers, infrastructure on a scale that suggested not just current production, but massive planned expansion. This is Randolph Field in Texas, Lang said, pointing to one photograph. Single training base. We count over 300 aircraft visible. Estimate total capacity, perhaps 500 or more. And this is just one base. Intelligence has identified at least 20 major training complexes across the United States, each with similar capacity. The implications were staggering. If American training bases held 500 aircraft each, and there were 20 such bases, that meant 10,000 training aircraft. More aircraft dedicated solely to instruction than Germany possessed in total across all operational types. The bomber crews they were fighting, the replacements that kept American formations at strength despite losses, were being produced by an industrial training system that operated on scales German military education had never conceived. They're building a pilot factory, Herman said quietly. Not training airmen individually. Not developing them through careful instruction and limited resources. They're manufacturing them. Mass production applied to human skill development. Feed recruits into the system at one end, extract trained bomber crews at the other, repeat until you have more trained personnel than you need, more than you could possibly use, more than could be destroyed by any conceivable enemy action. Weber shook his head slowly. If they can produce crews at this rate, and bombers to match, then our entire defensive strategy is based on false assumptions. We're trying to win through attrition, trying to make their losses unsustainable. But if their production exceeds our ability to inflict losses, then we can't win, Lang finished. Not through defensive operations, not through fighter interception. We would need to destroy their production capacity, bomb their factories, disrupt their training programs. But we lack the range to reach America, lack the bomber force to sustain strategic operations, even if we had the range, lack the industrial capacity to build what we would need while simultaneously defending against what they're already sending against us. The room absorbed this assessment in silence. These were experienced combat pilots, men who had faced death repeatedly, who had shot down enemy aircraft and watched friends die. They understood tactical success and operational necessity. What they were confronting now was strategic impossibility, the recognition that their individual victories, however skillful, couldn't accumulate into strategic advantage against an enemy whose resources made losses irrelevant. Herman pulled one of the photographs closer, studying the American training base with its ordered rows of aircraft, its sprawling infrastructure, its evidence of systematic mass production of military capability. We've been fighting the wrong war, he said quietly. We prepared for a conflict where resources mattered, where efficiency could overcome numerical disadvantage, where tactical excellence could compensate for industrial limitations. The Americans are fighting a different war entirely, one where resources are so abundant that efficiency becomes optional, where numerical advantage is so overwhelming that tactical excellence is merely an accelerant rather than a necessity, where industrial capacity makes strategy itself a question of time rather than skill. He stood up, gathering the photographs. I'll fly tomorrow. I'll engage American bombers and try to shoot them down. I'll do my duty, but I'll do it knowing that every bomber I destroy is replaced before it hits the ground, that every American crew I kill is matched by 3 more completing training, that every tactical victory we achieve is strategically meaningless because we're fighting an industrial system, not an air force. And you can't shoot down a factory. The pilots filed out slowly, returning to their quarters to rest before the next mission. Outside, the sound of air raid sirens began wailing again. not an attack on their base, but on industrial targets 50 kilometers away. More American bombers, arriving as predictably as weather, delivering destruction with mechanical regularity. Herman stood alone in the briefing room, looking at photographs that revealed a truth his superiors seemed unwilling to accept. Germany was fighting an enemy that could afford to lose, could absorb casualties, could sustain operations that would bankrupt lesser industrial powers. The American bomber offensive wasn't failing under the weight of German defensive success. It was growing stronger, fed by production capacity that made current losses merely the price of inevitable victory. He thought about his 2 kills from the previous day. 20 American airmen who wouldn't return home. 2 bombers that represented perhaps $2 million of American industrial investment. In a traditional calculus, this was victory, enemy resources destroyed, enemy personnel killed, defensive objectives achieved. But in the mathematics of industrial warfare, it was nothing, less than nothing, because those bombers would be replaced within a week, those crews within a month, and the missions would continue with unbroken rhythm until every German city was rubble and every factory was ash. Herman turned off the lights and walked into the spring evening. Above, contrails were etching white lines across the sky. Bombers at altitude, heading toward targets deeper in Germany, escorted by fighters that now ranged farther than intelligence said was possible. The war in the sky was already lost. His superiors simply hadn't accepted it yet. The Americans would keep coming back. Not because they were brave, though they were. Not because their aircraft were superior, though increasingly they were. But because they could afford to, because their industrial capacity made persistence costless, because abundance had become a weapon more deadly than any bomb. The scale of American industrial mobilization for strategic bombing became fully visible through logistics rather than combat operations. German intelligence officers analyzing supply movements to British airfields in mid-1943 compiled data that revealed an industrial support system operating on scales that defied European understanding. Each B-17 bombing mission required approximately 2,400 gallons of high-octane aviation fuel. A formation of 300 bombers, increasingly common by summer 1943, consumed 720,000 gallons per mission. The 8th Air Force was launching major operations every 3 to 4 days, meaning weekly fuel consumption exceeded 2 million gallons for bomber operations alone, not counting fighter escort or training flights. This fuel arrived in Britain aboard tankers that crossed the Atlantic in convoys, carrying refined gasoline from American petroleum facilities that produced more in a day than Germany's entire synthetic fuel industry produced in a week. The logistics system that delivered this fuel operated with reliability that German supply officers found incomprehensible. Ships departing American ports on schedule, convoys arriving despite U-boat attacks, distribution networks delivering fuel to airfields with such consistency that American bomber groups never delayed missions due to fuel shortages. The bomb logistics were equally staggering. A typical B-17 carried 4,000 to 6,000 pounds of bombs depending on target distance and defensive load. 300 bombers carried 1,500,000 pounds of ordnance, 750 tons of explosive power delivered in a single mission. The 8th Air Force was dropping approximately 3,000 tons of bombs weekly by mid-1943, and this would increase to over 10,000 tons weekly by early 1944. Every bomb had to be manufactured, transported across the Atlantic, stored in Britain, moved to airfields, loaded onto aircraft. The industrial and logistical chain required to sustain this bombardment represented civilian industrial capacity equivalent to Germany's entire munitions production. And this was just one aspect of American military operations, running parallel to Pacific operations, Lend-Lease deliveries, and support for other Allied forces. German economic planners studying captured American logistics documents experienced profound cognitive dissonance. The Americans were treating strategic bombing logistics the way Germany treated rifle ammunition, as a consumable resource to be produced in vast quantities and expended freely. The careful calculation that characterized German ordnance production, The precise matching of manufacturing capacity to operational requirements was absent from American logistics planning. Instead, Americans produced bombs in such quantities that waste was acceptable, that stockpiling was routine, that operational planning never needed to account for ordnance shortages. The replacement aircraft pipeline revealed similar abundance. New B-17s arrived in Britain at a rate exceeding 100 per month by mid-1943. They flew across the Atlantic in stages, from American factories to Newfoundland, from Newfoundland to Greenland, from Greenland to Iceland, from Iceland to Britain, creating a conveyor belt of bomber delivery that operated with the regularity of a rail schedule. Each aircraft arrived equipped with spare parts, tools, technical manuals, even specialized ground equipment. The Americans weren't just delivering bombers. They were delivering complete operational packages that included everything needed to integrate the aircraft into combat units. German logistics officers, accustomed to aircraft arriving with minimal support equipment and requiring weeks of preparation before operational readiness, couldn't comprehend logistics that treated bombers as plug-and-play components in an industrial system. The aircrew replacement system was even more sophisticated. New crews completed training in the United States and were shipped to Britain aboard ocean liners converted to troop transports. They arrived in groups of 50 to 100 crews at a time, passed through operational training units in Britain for orientation to combat conditions, then were distributed to bomb groups as replacements for losses or to fill out new units. The training pipeline ensured that crew replacements always exceeded losses. Even during periods of heavy casualties, the notorious Schweinfurt raids of August and October 1943, where loss rates approached 20%, replacement crews arrived in sufficient numbers to not just maintain strength, but expand it. American bomb groups that lost 15 crews in a raid would receive 20 replacements within 2 weeks. This created an experience dynamic that favored Americans despite their higher initial casualty rates. German fighter pilots accumulated experience because they flew continuously until killed or severely wounded. American bomber crews accumulated experience until completing their 25-mission tour, then rotated home and were replaced by fresh crews. This meant the average experience level of American crews remained relatively constant, while German pilot quality declined as veterans were killed and replacements had insufficient training. The industrial support extended to maintenance and repair. American bomb groups deployed with mobile repair facilities, machine shops, electronics workshops, engine overhaul capabilities that could rebuild damaged bombers in the field. Aircraft that sustained battle damage were often flying again within days, sometimes hours. The spare parts inventory at each base exceeded what entire German bomber units possessed in total. One captured Luftwaffe document, a report from an intelligence officer who observed a captured B-17 being dismantled for technical analysis, noted with evident frustration. The aircraft's maintenance log indicates it has flown 48 combat missions. Multiple components show replacement: engines, propellers, control surfaces, instruments. Yet the airframe is considered fully operational. American maintenance philosophy treats individual components as replaceable modules rather than integral systems. This allows sustained operation at tempo that would degrade German aircraft beyond repair. The bomber we captured is essentially ship of Theseus. Every part replaced, yet considered the same aircraft, accumulating missions while being continuously rebuilt. The reference to the ship of Theseus, the philosophical paradox about whether an object with all parts replaced remains the same object, was telling. German aircraft were maintained as integrated systems, with component replacement being exceptional rather than routine. American aircraft were maintained as platforms where every component was expected to be replaced multiple times during the aircraft's service life. This maintenance philosophy was only possible with logistics that delivered spare parts in vast quantities and maintenance personnel trained to treat replacement as standard procedure. By late 1943, German intelligence had compiled statistics that painted an undeniable picture of American industrial superiority. The United States was producing 4 heavy bombers for every one destroyed in combat. Crew training was producing 5 replacement crews for every crew lost. Fuel production exceeded consumption by factors that allowed stockpiling for future intensive operations. Bomb production was outpacing drop rates, creating reserves of ordnance that could sustain intensified campaigns. The mathematics were crushing. Even if German defenses achieved impossibly favorable loss ratios, destroying 2 American bombers for every one that returned, American production would still increase bomber strength over time. The industrial system behind the bombing campaign was designed to absorb losses that would cripple other air forces and emerge stronger. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, received these intelligence assessments with denial that bordered on delusion. In a meeting with fighter commanders in September 1943, he reportedly dismissed the production figures as Allied propaganda. The Americans cannot possibly produce bombers at the rates claimed. Such production would require industrial capacity beyond any nation's ability. Our intelligence is being deceived by inflated numbers designed to damage our morale. But the bomber formations appearing over Germany weren't propaganda. They were physical evidence of industrial capacity that exceeded German comprehension. 300 bomber raids became routine by autumn 1943. 400 bomber missions followed. By early 1944, 1,000 bomber raids, once considered the maximum theoretical strength the Americans could field, became regular occurrences. Each raid represented industrial mobilization on a scale that invalidated German strategic assumptions. The factories producing these bombers were themselves products of rapid construction. New facilities built in months, equipped with tooling produced in weeks, staffed by workers trained in days. The American approach to industrial expansion was to build capacity faster than it could be destroyed, to create production systems so distributed and redundant that bombing individual factories was strategically meaningless. German bombing of British airfields housing American bombers occasionally achieved tactical success, destroying aircraft on the ground, damaging runways, disrupting operations. But the damage was repaired within days. The destroyed bombers replaced within a week. Operations resumed with minimal delay. The Americans could absorb facility destruction the way they absorbed aircraft losses, as temporary setbacks in a campaign sustained by industrial reserves that made setbacks irrelevant. The existential revelation for German planners was that they were fighting an economic system, not just a military force. The B-17s over Germany were merely the visible expression of American industrial civilization fully mobilized for war. Behind each bomber stood factories producing aluminum, refineries producing fuel, training bases producing crews, shipyards producing transports, all coordinated through logistics that treated transcontinental and transoceanic supply chains as routine operations. Germany had mobilized for war by converting civilian production to military use, by rationing resources, by extracting maximum efficiency from limited capacity. America had mobilized by building new capacity so vast it dwarfed pre-war production of all types, by treating military production as additional to rather than replacing civilian industry, by creating an arsenal of democracy that could sustain both guns and butter while its enemies chose between them. The bomber offensive was proof of concept, demonstration that democratic industrial capitalism could outproduce authoritarian command economies by margins that made military outcomes inevitable. Every raid was a lesson in productive capacity. Every replacement bomber was evidence of industrial superiority. Every returning crew was testimony to logistics that kept operations sustainable despite losses. And the Germans learned, slowly and painfully, that they were fighting a war they had already lost not in tactical defeats or strategic failures, but in the industrial decisions made before the first shot was fired, in the economic systems that shaped each nation's productive capacity, in the fundamental difference between scarcity management and abundance utilization. The bombers kept coming back, not because they were indestructible, but because behind each loss stood a factory producing replacements. Not because their crews were immortal, but because behind each casualty stood a training system producing successors. Not because the missions were easy, but because the industrial capacity supporting them made difficulty irrelevant to ultimate success. Germany had expected the bombers to exhaust themselves, to be worn down by casualties, to fail under the weight of their own losses. Instead, the bombers brought the storm back, again and again, in formations that grew larger, carrying ordnance that grew heavier, sustained by industrial capacity that grew stronger even as German defenses grew weaker. The mathematics of industrial warfare had spoken. The side with factories won. Lieutenant Robert Morgan stood in the debriefing room at Thorpe Abbott's airfield, England, on October 14, 1943, the day of the Second Schweinfurt raid, the mission that would become known as Black Thursday for the catastrophic losses sustained. His crew had just returned from the mission, their B-17 Memphis Belle shot full of holes but still flying, its No. 2 engine feathered, hydraulics failing, fuel gauges reading empty. 60 bombers had been lost that day. 600 men killed, captured, or missing. The mission had achieved its objectives. The ball-bearing factories at Schweinfurt were damaged, but the cost seemed unbearable. The intelligence officer conducting debriefing moved from crew to crew, recording what they'd seen, documenting the fighters that attacked, the flak they'd encountered, the bombers they'd watched go down. When he reached Morgan's crew, the intelligence officer's face was drawn with exhaustion and something else, calculation. 27th mission, he noted, checking Morgan's log. You're done. You've completed your tour. The Belle can go home. Morgan nodded, relief flooding through him. 27 missions when the requirement was 25, but they'd flown extras while paperwork was processed. He'd survived when so many hadn't. His crew was intact. Their bomber was wrecked, but reparable. They'd done their duty. What happens to the plane? Morgan asked. She'll be repaired and reassigned. Or, if the damage is too extensive, stripped for parts and a replacement allocated to the squadron. Morgan looked out the window at the Memphis Belle, sitting on the hard stand with maintenance crews already swarming over it, assessing damage, calculating repairs. The aircraft had brought them through 27 missions, Bremen, Wilhelmshaven, Lorient, Frankfurt, dozens more. It had absorbed flak damage, fighter attacks, mechanical failures, and kept flying. And now it would be fixed and sent out again, with a new crew, to face the same deadly skies. How long until we're back to strength? Morgan asked. The intelligence officer checked his clipboard. Replacement aircraft arriving tomorrow. 7B, 17GS, latest variant, improved armament. Replacement crews arriving day after tomorrow. 12 crews, all training complete. Will be above authorized strength by the weekend. Morgan processed this. 60 bombers lost today. Replacement for those losses arriving within a week. The group would pause briefly to integrate new crews, then resume operations. Black Thursday would be remembered for its casualties, but it wouldn't stop the campaign. It wouldn't even slow it significantly. The Germans, Morgan said slowly, they have to believe we can't sustain this. 60 bombers in one day, they have to think we'll pause, regroup, maybe even abandon daylight bombing. The intelligence officer shrugged. German intelligence consistently underestimates American production. They calculate based on their own industrial capacity, their own resource limitations. They don't understand that we're producing bombers faster than they can shoot them down. Today was costly, but strategically it's just a data point. We lost 60. We built 150. The math favors us even on our worst days. Morgan left the debriefing and walked across the airfield. The sun was setting, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for a day of such death. Around him, ground crews were working on damaged bombers, patching holes, replacing engines, repairing control surfaces. The work proceeded with practiced efficiency, mechanics treating catastrophic battle damage as routine maintenance problems to be solved with available parts and skilled labor. He passed a bomber that had landed with half its tail shot away, the vertical stabilizer shredded by flak, rudder hanging by cables. The crew had made it back through skill and luck, nursing the crippled aircraft across the channel, coaxing it to a safe landing despite controls that barely responded. Now, less than 2 hours after landing, Maintenance crews had the damaged tail section removed and were preparing to install a replacement fabricated from spare parts and salvage components. "She'll fly in 3 days," a crew chief told Morgan, noticing his interest. "New tail section, patch the fuselage holes, replace hydraulics, test flight on day 4. Combat ready by day 5. "You've done this before," Morgan observed. "Every week, seems like. Bomber comes back shot to hell, we rebuild it, it goes out again. That's the job. The Germans think if they damage a bomber bad enough, it's done. They don't understand we've got entire warehouses full of parts. Tail sections, wings, engines, instruments, everything prefabricated, ready to install. We treat bombers like they're made of Lego blocks. Swap out the broken pieces, add new ones, keep them flying." Morgan nodded, understanding dawning. The Germans were fighting a war of attrition, trying to destroy American bombers faster than they could be replaced. But replacement wasn't the issue. Repair, rebuild, and return to service was happening so quickly that destroyed bombers were often flying again before German intelligence could confirm the kills. The industrial system wasn't just producing new aircraft. It was sustaining damaged ones through logistics that treated catastrophic damage as temporary inconvenience. He walked to the crew quarters, passing the chapel where service was being held for the crews lost that day. 60 bombers meant 600 empty bunks tonight, 600 letters to write home, 600 families who would receive telegrams. The human cost was real and terrible. But Morgan had learned something during his tour that the Germans apparently hadn't grasped. American strategy accepted these costs as necessary, factored them into operational planning, and sustained operations despite them, because the industrial capacity behind the bomber offensive made casualties tactically significant but strategically irrelevant. The replacement crews arriving in 2 days wouldn't know the men who died today. They would occupy the same bunks, fly the same missions, face the same dangers. And if they were lost, more replacements would arrive. The system was designed for sustainability through replacement, for persistence through industrial capacity, for victory through the simple mathematics of producing faster than the enemy could destroy. Morgan thought about his German counterparts, the fighter pilots who had attacked his formation, who had pressed through defensive fire to shoot down bombers, who had achieved tactical victories that any military in history would celebrate. Those pilots would return to bases where fuel was rationed, where replacement aircraft were delayed, where every loss was a gap that might not be filled for weeks or months. They would achieve kill ratios that favored them, shoot down more bombers than they lost fighters, and still be losing the war because their victories couldn't be sustained at scale. The next morning, Morgan watched from the flight line as 7 new B-17GS taxied in from their transatlantic delivery flight. The aircraft were factory fresh, still bearing the smell of new paint and hydraulic fluid, equipped with the latest modifications. Chin turrets for improved frontal defense, upgraded engines, enhanced armor. They represented American production capacity from the previous month. Aircraft that had been aluminum, ore, and raw materials 8 weeks ago were now fully operational weapons systems, ready for combat. The replacement crews arrived the following day, young men fresh from training bases in Texas and Arizona, carrying duffel bags and anxious excitement. They had hundreds of hours of flight training, had practiced formation, flying, and bombing runs, had learned gunnery and navigation and crew coordination. But they hadn't experienced combat, hadn't felt the aircraft shudder from flak impacts, hadn't watched other bombers explode in midair. Morgan was assigned to brief one of the replacement crews, standard procedure for veteran crews completing tours, passing knowledge to newcomers. He gathered them in a briefing room and looked at their faces, seeing his own face from a year ago, remembering the confidence that came from ignorance of what combat actually meant. The briefings will tell you about formations, about target approaches, about defensive tactics, Morgan began. I'm going to tell you about something else, about why we're winning even when it feels like we're losing. He had their attention. Yesterday, we lost 60 bombers. Worst single-day losses of the war. The Germans probably think they won, that they've proven daylight bombing is unsustainable. But look around. Those 7 new bombers on the flight line? They replace 7 of yesterday's losses. U-12 crews? You replaced 12 lost crews. By the weekend, this group will be stronger than it was before the mission. He paused, letting them absorb this. The Germans can't do that. When they lose a fighter, replacement takes weeks. When they lose a pilot, the replacement has half the training you've received because they don't have fuel for training flights. They're fighting with scarcity, calculating every resource, trying to make minimum necessary force achieve objectives. We're fighting with abundance. We have enough fuel to train properly, enough aircraft to replace losses, enough industrial capacity to treat bombers as consumable tools rather than irreplaceable assets. One of the young pilots raised his hand. But sir, if we're losing bombers at this rate, how is that sustainable? 60 in one day. That's got to impact operations. It does, Morgan acknowledged. Black Thursday will force us to pause deep penetration missions until we get long-range fighter escort. But the pause will be weeks, not months. And when we resume, we'll come back stronger because we'll have P-51 Mustangs escorting us all the way to target and back. The Germans damaged our tactics yesterday, but tactics can adapt. They can't damage our industrial capacity. That's in America, 3,000 miles away, producing bombers and training crews and refining fuel at rates they can't touch. He stood up, gesturing toward the window where ground crews were already integrating the new B-17GS into the squadron. Here's what you need to understand. Every mission you fly, you're not just dropping bombs. You're demonstrating American industrial power. Every bomber that returns proves we can sustain operations. Every bomber that's shot down and replaced within a week proves our production exceeds their destruction. The Germans are trying to win through attrition. But you can't win an attrition war against an enemy that produces faster than you can kill. The briefing ended, and Morgan walked out into the autumn air. His war was over. He'd completed his tour, would return to the States, probably do publicity tours to sell war bonds, help with training programs. The Memphis Belle would be repaired and fly again with a different crew. The war would continue without him, sustained by the industrial system that treated individual participation as temporary, but collective effort as unstoppable. That evening, he wrote a letter to his family, tried to articulate what he'd learned. We lost a lot of good men today, and it hurts in ways I can't fully express. But I've realized something important. We're not winning because we're braver or our aircraft are better. We're winning because America can build bombers faster than Germany can shoot them down, can train crews faster than they can kill them, can produce fuel and bombs and parts faster than they can be consumed. It's a war of factories, and our factories are bigger. The outcome was decided before the first bomb fell. We're just flying the missions to prove it. By December 1943, the cumulative impact of the American bombing campaign was reshaping German industrial capacity in ways that validated the strategic concept despite tactical costs. The attacks on ball-bearing production at Schweinfurt, while costly to the Americans, had created severe disruptions in German weapons production. Ball bearings were critical components in everything from aircraft engines to tank transmissions, and their manufacture required precision machining that couldn't be easily dispersed or replaced. Albert Speer, as Minister of Armaments, compiled reports showing that the Schweinfurt raids had reduced ball-bearing production by 67% in the immediate aftermath. German industry had reserves that temporarily masked the impact, but by late 1943, production of various weapons systems was declining due to ball-bearing shortages. Tank production dropped by 12%, aircraft production by 8%, all traceable directly to damaged ball-bearing facilities. What made this reduction strategically significant was timing. Germany was facing increasing pressure on all fronts. The Eastern Front consuming vast quantities of equipment, the Mediterranean requiring sustained reinforcements, the Atlantic Wall demanding resources for fortification. The bombing campaign wasn't just destroying production. It was destroying production at the moment when increased output was critically needed. Speer's response demonstrated both German technical competence and the fundamental limitations they faced. He dispersed ball-bearing production to smaller facilities, relocated critical machinery to underground factories, implemented efficiency improvements that partially offset lost capacity. By March 1944, ball bearing production had recovered to approximately 85% of pre-raid levels, a remarkable achievement in industrial resilience. But recovery came at a cost. The resources devoted to rebuilding ball bearing production, machinery, skilled workers, transportation, raw materials, were resources unavailable for other purposes. Every engineer assigned to restore Schweinfurt was an engineer not designing new weapons. Every rail car carrying machinery to dispersed facilities was a rail car not delivering supplies to the front. The bombing campaign was forcing Germany to allocate resources to recovery rather than expansion, to maintaining current capacity rather than building new capacity. The American strategic bombing campaign was achieving its objectives not through destroying German industry completely, but through forcing Germany to fight a two-front industrial war, producing weapons for the military while simultaneously rebuilding bomb facilities. And this industrial two-front war was being waged against an enemy that faced no similar pressure, whose factories operated without threat of attack, whose industrial expansion continued unimpeded. The oil campaign, beginning in earnest in spring 1944, would prove even more devastating. Synthetic fuel plants were complex facilities requiring specialized equipment and skilled operators. They were also large, visible targets that American bombers could hit with increasing accuracy as tactics improved and fighter escort extended deeper into Germany. The first major raids on oil facilities in May 1944 achieved damage that immediately impacted military operations. Fuel production dropped by 15% in the first month, 30% by the second month. Luftwaffe operations were scaled back due to fuel shortages. Training flights were reduced to conserve aviation gasoline. Tank units received reduced fuel allocations, limiting their operational mobility. Speer's reports to Hitler became increasingly desperate. "The enemy has struck at our weakest point," he wrote in June 1944. "We can replace destroyed aircraft factories, can rebuild ball bearing plants, can compensate for many types of industrial damage. But we cannot operate without fuel. Every raid on synthetic fuel plants is a raid on our ability to continue fighting. If the Americans sustain this campaign, our military operations will degrade regardless of weapons production." The Americans sustained the campaign. Oil facilities were hit repeatedly, with bombers returning to targets as soon as repairs were attempted. The tonnage of bombs dropped on oil production facilities increased from 5,000 tons in May 1944 to 15,000 tons in July, to 25,000 tons in September. By autumn 1944, German fuel production had collapsed to less than 30% of pre-campaign levels. The impact cascaded through German military operations. The Luftwaffe, which had fielded approximately 2,000 fighters in early 1944, was reduced to fewer than 1,000 operational aircraft by autumn. Not because aircraft weren't available, but because fuel to fly them wasn't. Pilot training, which had already been reduced due to fuel shortages, nearly ceased. New pilots arrived at operational units with as little as 30 hours of flight time, barely able to fly their aircraft, certainly not prepared for combat against American pilots with 400-plus hours of training. Tank operations suffered similarly. The sophisticated armor that German industry continued producing sat immobile for lack of fuel. The Panther and Tiger tanks that were technically superior to American Shermans couldn't reach battlefields because the fuel to move them didn't exist. Entire armor divisions were effectively grounded, their combat power negated not by enemy action, but by fuel poverty created through strategic bombing. The transportation network collapsed under combined pressure of fuel shortages and direct bombing. Rail yards were primary targets for American bombers, and the Germans discovered that repairing rail infrastructure required resources that were increasingly unavailable. Destroyed bridges needed steel that was allocated to weapons production. Bombed marshalling yards needed reconstruction equipment that was diverted to building fortifications. Every attack created demands that competed with other critical needs, forcing choices between bad options. By early 1945, the German economy was in a death spiral driven by strategic bombing. Industry that hadn't been directly damaged was failing due to lack of transportation, lack of power, lack of raw materials. The coal that fueled German industry couldn't be moved from mines to factories because rail lines were destroyed. The electricity that powered factories was unreliable because power plants were bombed and coal deliveries were disrupted. The workers who operated machinery were absent because they were sheltering from air raids or had been killed in attacks on cities. Speer's final production reports documented the collapse. Aircraft production, which had reached 40,000 units in 1944 despite bombing, fell to less than 5,000 in the first quarter of 1945. Tank production dropped from 1,500 per month to fewer than 300. Ammunition production declined so severely that German forces were rationing artillery shells, limiting firing to critical moments, unable to sustain the barrages that had characterized earlier fighting. The strategic bombing campaign had achieved what its architects intended: the systematic destruction of Germany's ability to wage industrial warfare. The cost had been terrible: tens of thousands of American and British airmen killed, thousands of bombers lost, billions of dollars expended. But the result was the collapse of German war production, the paralysis of military operations, the demonstration that industrial capacity was the foundation of modern military power. In the post-war years, as historians and participants analyzed the strategic bombing campaign, debates emerged about its effectiveness, its morality, its place in the Allied victory. The statistics were compiled, the damage assessed, the costs calculated. What emerged was a complex picture of a campaign that had been less effective than its proponents claimed, but more effective than its critics acknowledged. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted immediately after the war, concluded that strategic bombing had reduced German war production by approximately 20 to 25% compared to what it would have been without bombing. This seemed modest given the resources expended, but the survey also noted that this reduction came at the critical period of 1944 to 1945, when Germany needed maximum production to sustain operations on multiple fronts. A 25% reduction in output during the decisive phase of the war was strategically significant, even if it wasn't the decisive factor proponents had predicted. More importantly, the bombing campaign had forced Germany to allocate enormous resources to air defense, resources that would otherwise have been used offensively. By 1944, Germany had over 1 million personnel assigned to anti-aircraft defense, operating 50,000+ anti-aircraft guns, consuming ammunition and resources that were desperately needed elsewhere. Fighter aircraft that could have supported ground operations were instead defending German airspace. The bombing campaign had created a strategic dilemma where Germany had to choose between accepting industrial destruction or defending industry with forces needed at the front. The psychological impact was equally significant. German civilian morale, while never collapsing completely, was severely degraded by sustained bombing. Workers in factories operated under constant fear of air raids. Cities were progressively destroyed, creating refugee populations that strained resources. The bombing demonstrated that the German government couldn't protect its own territory, undermining confidence in ultimate victory. Albert Speer, in his post-war memoirs and testimony, acknowledged the campaign's effectiveness with professional respect. The Americans approached strategic bombing as an industrial problem to be solved through systematic application of resources. They calculated tonnages required, developed tactics to deliver those tonnages, and sustained operations until objectives were achieved. We attempted to counter with efficiency and improvisation, but ultimately we couldn't match the sheer weight of resources they brought to bear. It wasn't that our defenses failed. It was that their capacity to sustain offensive operations exceeded our capacity to sustain defensive ones. The comparison between American and German approaches to industrial warfare became a case study in post-war military education. The Americans had demonstrated that democratic industrial systems, when fully mobilized, possessed advantages in sustained operations that centrally planned economies couldn't match. The flexibility of market economies, the innovation driven by competition, the efficiency improvements motivated by profit, all translated into military advantages when applied to war production. German industry, for all its technical sophistication, had operated under constraints that limited its effectiveness. Central planning created inefficiencies that were masked during peacetime, but became critical during war. The inability to rapidly redirect resources, the bureaucratic delays in decision-making, the lack of market mechanisms to optimize production. All these factors meant that German industry, while capable of remarkable achievements, couldn't match American output even when German factories weren't being bombed. The bombing campaign had exposed these differences ruthlessly. American bombers, produced by an industrial system that treated them as consumable items, had attacked German industry that couldn't replace losses quickly enough. American logistics, built on abundance, had sustained operations that German logistics, built on scarcity, couldn't counter. American training programs, treating pilot production as mass manufacturing, had created replacement flows that German training, limited by fuel and aircraft, couldn't match. On May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, the 8th Air Force in England stood at the peak of its strength. Over 2,000 heavy bombers were operational, with hundreds more in reserve. Fighter groups had transitioned to long-range P-51 Mustangs that could escort bombers to any target in Germany and return. The industrial and logistical system supporting these forces could have sustained operations indefinitely. Fuel reserves were adequate for months of maximum tempo operations. Bomb stockpiles exceeded all projected requirements. Replacement aircraft and crews were arriving faster than they could be absorbed. The force that had struggled to put 100 bombers over Germany in 1942 could now launch 1,500 bomber raids as routine operations. The Americans, who had been told that strategic bombing couldn't work, that losses would be unsustainable, that German defenses would make daylight operations impossible, had proven all these predictions wrong through the simple expedient of producing more than could be destroyed, of sustaining more than could be defeated, of building an air armada so large that losses were strategically meaningless. German fighter pilots who survived the war spoke of the progressive demoralization of watching the bomber formations grow larger. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, who commanded fighter units through the war's final years, later wrote, "In 1943, we could see individual bombers, could count them, could calculate that if we shot down enough, the raids would stop. By 1944, the formations were so large they filled the sky from horizon to horizon. You couldn't count them. You couldn't imagine shooting down enough to matter. They came in waves, in numbers that made our victories meaningless because there were always more." The industrial truth that Steinhoff described, that American production made tactical victories strategically irrelevant, was a decisive factor in the air war over Europe. The Germans had fought with courage, with technical skill, with tactical innovation. They had achieved kill ratios that would have defeated any previous enemy. But they had been fighting an industrial system that could absorb their best efforts and emerge stronger, that could sustain losses that would have destroyed other air forces and continue operations without pause. The bomber crews who flew these missions understood what they were part of. Lieutenant Joseph Armanini, a navigator who flew 25 missions in 1944, later reflected, "We weren't warriors in the traditional sense. We were components in an industrial process, trained, equipped, deployed, replaced if lost. It felt impersonal, mechanical, like we were parts in a machine. But that machine won the war. The Germans had warriors. We had an industrial system that produced warriors faster than they could be killed. In modern warfare, the system beats the individual every time." The Memphis Belle, Robert Morgan's aircraft, was indeed retired and returned to the United States for publicity purposes. It toured the country, appeared in a documentary film, helped sell war bonds worth millions of dollars. The aircraft that had seemed so fragile during combat, that had absorbed damage on 27 missions and kept flying, became a symbol of American industrial resilience, proof that abundance could overcome adversity, that production could defeat destruction. But the real Memphis Belle wasn't the single aircraft preserved in museums. It was the production line that built it and thousands like it. It was the training program that produced its crew and tens of thousands more. It was the logistics network that sustained it through 2 years of combat. It was the industrial civilization that could create such systems and sustain them despite losses that would have broken lesser industrial powers. The final truth of the strategic bombing campaign over Europe was written not in tactical victories or operational successes, but in industrial statistics that spoke to fundamental differences between democratic and authoritarian approaches to modern warfare. The numbers were compiled, analyzed, and they told a story that would echo through subsequent conflicts and shape military doctrine for generations. The United States produced 18,466 B-17 flying fortresses during the war. Each one represented aluminum that had been ore, rubber that had been sap, instruments that had been raw materials, transformed through industrial processes into weapons platforms that could carry the war to enemy territory. The production didn't slow when losses mounted. It accelerated. The factories that built B-17s operated around the clock, employed hundreds of thousands of workers, embodied an industrial mobilization that treated bomber production as a national priority second only to survival itself. Germany, fighting desperately to counter the bombing campaign, never achieved equivalent production in any aircraft type. The closest was the Bf-109 fighter, with approximately 34,000 produced across the entire war. Impressive until compared to American production of all types, which exceeded 300,000 aircraft. The disparity wasn't explained by German technical inadequacy or lack of effort. It was explained by fundamental differences in industrial capacity, in resource availability, in the economic systems that shaped production. The bomber offensive had proven that industrial democracies possessed inherent advantages in sustained conflict. The market mechanisms that optimized civilian production translated directly into military advantages: efficient resource allocation, rapid innovation, production flexibility that could respond to changing requirements. The authoritarian efficiencies that Germany prided itself on, central planning, directed labor, state control of production, proved less effective than democratic industrial systems when both were fully mobilized for war. The lessons learned shaped the post-war world. American military doctrine embraced industrial capacity as a strategic weapon, planning for conflicts where production determined outcomes. The NATO alliance was built partially on the assumption that Western industrial capacity would overwhelm Soviet military strength in any sustained conflict. The Cold War became, in many ways, an industrial competition where the side with superior productive capacity would prevail, an assumption validated when the Soviet Union collapsed under the economic strain of competing with American industrial might. The bombers themselves became obsolete within years of the war's end. Jets replaced propeller aircraft. Missiles replaced bombers for many strategic missions. Nuclear weapons made conventional strategic bombing seem quaint. But the industrial principles the bomber campaign validated remained central to military planning. Produce more than the enemy, sustain operations longer, replace losses faster, use industrial abundance as a weapon that enemies built on scarcity cannot counter. Robert Morgan, the Memphis Belle pilot who survived his tour and returned home, lived until 2004. He gave countless interviews, spoke to veteran groups, visited museums where B-17s were preserved. He always emphasized the same point: we didn't win because we were better pilots or braver men. The Germans had plenty of both. We won because America could build bombers faster than they could shoot them down. That was the whole game. Everything else, the tactics, the courage, the sacrifice, mattered only because the industrial foundation made it sustainable. The Germans never expected the bombers to return after raids like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, never anticipated that losses approaching 20% would be absorbed and operations would continue, never imagined that an enemy could sustain strategic bombing despite casualties that should have been prohibitive. They calculated based on their own industrial limitations, their own resource constraints, their own understanding of what was possible. But the Americans brought the storm back, again and again, in numbers that grew larger despite losses, with persistence that didn't flag despite casualties. Supported by industrial capacity, that treated bombers as consumable ammunition rather than precious assets. The storm returned because behind it stood factories that worked 3 shifts, that employed millions, that produced with such abundance that loss was factored into planning rather than feared as catastrophe. The sky over Germany, which had been German domain in 1940, belonged to America by 1944. Not because American aircraft were superior, often they weren't. Not because American pilots were better trained, initially they weren't. But because American industry could produce more, sustain more, replace more, build more, until numerical advantage became overwhelming, until tactical skill couldn't compensate for strategic disparity, until courage couldn't overcome mathematics. The bombers returned because America could afford their return, could accept their losses, could sustain their operations indefinitely. The industrial civilization that built them had mobilized completely, had transformed its productive capacity from peace to war, had demonstrated that free people working in free markets could outproduce any authoritarian system when motivated by righteous cause. And the lesson echoed forward through history, a truth carved in contrails and written in production statistics. In industrial warfare between modern nations, abundance defeats scarcity, production overcomes destruction, and factories ultimately decide battles that courage begins but cannot finish alone. The Germans never expected the bombers to return, but they came back every day, every week, every month, until the factories were ruins, until the fuel was exhausted, until the fighters were grounded, until surrender was the only option remaining. The storm returned because it was built in American factories, sustained by American logistics, flown by American crews who knew that behind every loss stood a nation producing replacements. They brought the storm back, and the thunder of those engines, heard daily over German cities, was the sound of industrial democracy proving its superiority, not through ideology or rhetoric, but through the irrefutable mathematics of production that turned resources into weapons, weapons into missions, and missions into inevitable victory.